Connolly back with To the Point. Democrats have made higher education central to this year's presidential campaign. With the costs of higher education skyrocketing, graduates are collectively $1.3 billion in debt. So Hillary Clinton wants to make college more affordable. Bernie Sanders is demanding that it should be free. But here's a troubling question. If college is necessary to getting a job, why are so many four-year graduates underemployed? Mike Rowe has some answers. He's host of the Discovery Channel's series Dirty Jobs. Good to have you on our program. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Warren. Nice to be here.
You've talked about concern about a one-size-fits-all approach. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, the numbers are so big, even the experts get confused. In fact, I think, unless I heard it wrong on the phone, you just said $1.3 billion. In fact, it's $1.3 trillion. The debt that's being carried.
Thank you for that correction. $1.3 trillion? Are you?
$1.3 trillion. Yeah, we just got from 1.2 to 1.3. It wasn't in the headlines, but it ought to be, because one of the tricks that happens both politically and just socially, in my opinion, is that when you wind up talking about the importance of college, people hear you talking about the importance of education. And of course, they're not the same thing. The importance of an education can't be overstated, but the importance of a four-year degree, especially with respect to other alternative forms of learning, gets hugely twisted up into a lot of one-size-fits-all promises, and on the part of the candidates, it's used, in my view, in ways to curry favor that are pretty transparent.
What about the alternatives?
The alternatives are everywhere, and they always have been. Apprenticeship programs, trade schools, on-the-job training opportunities. So many big companies right now have invested hugely in training people specifically for the jobs that actually exist, because certainly it's not happening on the four-year side. And even on the trade side, sometimes the specialities that are required are so unique that the only way to get a qualified worker is to train them from the ground up. This has been going on for a long time, but for what it's worth, and from my perspective on the show that I've worked on for the last 10 years, I've seen it in every single state. Jobs that actually exist are the ones that are most vexing, because there they sit, and a trained workforce is simply not on hand to fill them.
Is there something about them that is less than what would be required by somebody who had a four-year degree? Should people feel somehow inferior if they take those jobs?
Well, look, it's such a giant topic. The short version, in my view, is that over the last 4 or 5 decades, college got a PR campaign. It needed one. There weren't enough people who were really focused on higher learning, and there was a certain reverse kind of elitism associated with it, I think. But like so much PR, what ultimately happens is we wind up promoting one form of education, in this case, at the expense of the others. And so both on a social level and certainly on a parental level, even in guidance counselors' offices, you see this false choice being offered to a lot of kids. Go into debt, get the four-year degree, declare a major. You're only 18 years old. Assume the relative value of a mortgage in terms of debt, and off you go. And what winds up happening is we're just not showing kids the entirety of the options that are available, nor are we factoring in the real weight of the debt that so many of them assume.
And the debt partly due to the PR campaign, which drives up demand. Demand leads to competition, and that leads to an increase in costs because they want to supply fancy dorms and gyms and all kinds of other amenities.
People scratch their head and say, how in the world did college get so expensive? But honestly, I'm not sure where the mystery is. We've consistently told the last generation that the best path for the most people is this one well-worn path toward a four-year degree. We've, at the same time, quietly disparaged all of the other options. And then the coup de grace, we've made over $1 trillion available. The pressure on these kids to borrow the money is huge at a time in their life when pressure is powerful. So when you take unlimited money and combine it with, this no matter how slight, this false choice in terms of quality of education. Yeah, it's kind of like the housing bubble. You know, the first step is to make people completely believe that living in an apartment is in some way inferior to living in a home, then free up the money, then let go of the regulations, then stand back and watch the price go through the roof. Same thing with education.
Mike Rowe, host of Discovery Channel's Dirty Jobs series. Let's talk to somebody who represents what we're talking about. Nick Roman is a college graduate. He also has retrained himself to be a welder. Nick Roman, good to have you on our program. Tell us, if you will, how this came about. When did you become a college graduate? When did you become a welder?
So I graduated college in around 2010, which at the time was right when the economy went down. So entering that market with a college degree when everybody was getting laid off was very difficult in trying to find a job. With the market being flooded with, older people who had experience who had been laid off from other jobs, at that point, trying to find a job with a college degree was very difficult because we lacked experience. And then the decision made by some of my peers was, the job market isn't ripe right now. What we should do is continue on and seek that higher education that Mr. Rowe was talking about. So some people, what they did was put themselves more in debt to go to graduate school to give themselves, more PR personally, because now they have this higher degree, which would make them more, available or more wanted by jobs or companies. Well, when I graduated, I graduated a degree in media, and at that time I worked for several studios that went under because of the funding and whatnot. And the jobs just simply weren't there. They weren't available. And so instead of putting myself into more debt to go to graduate school, I actually did the research, looked up, which jobs, which trades were still very, very common and, needed, jobs that are an area where people are constantly needed to fulfill a position in a job, and welding was actually the first thing to come up. And so I put myself into trade school and was able to become, a welder and find a job and, try to eliminate some of that debt by becoming a welder.
So you went to the University of California at Riverside, a very distinguished university, studied media, and now you are welding. Tell us about the satisfactions of that job.
It's very satisfying. Actually, the most satisfying thing is the comfort of living. I mean, I make a decent wage, enough to pay my bills, enough to have health insurance, a 401k, and at my age, be able to have those things. I have other peers that have graduated from college that are still living at home, in debt, can't afford their car, living from paycheck to paycheck. For me right now, my dream is, being able to pay for that roof over my house, having that apartment, saving that money, not having to worry about my car or transportation going to work. And at the same time, I've never thought at this age I'd have a 401k and being prepared for, the years later on down, when I retire.
How much debt did you have when you graduated from UC Riverside?
When I graduated from UC Riverside, I was around $16,000 in debt.
Mike Rowe, I want to go back to you with the Dirty Discovery Channel's series, Dirty Jobs. You were an opera singer.
Once upon a time, true enough.
How'd you get from that to this?
Well, my granddad built the house I was born in without a blueprint, and I wanted very much to follow in his footsteps. But the handy gene, tragically, is recessive. And so he told me when I was about 17, look, you can be a tradesman. Just get yourself a different toolbox. And I always took that advice to heart because it really was the way he worked that I was enamored of, more so than the actual things he did. The mindset of a tradesman, in my view, is something that so many people could benefit from embracing today. It's the classic freelancer mentality. For me, it just made better sense to learn to sing, learn to act, learn to host shows, narrate shows. My toolbox was different.
Let me introduce Jeff Zelenko. He's author of There Is Life After College. He's also a contributor to the Washington Post. And, Jeff, good to have you on our program.
It's great to be here, Warren.
This is the time when kids are getting their acceptances from various colleges and universities.
Yes, and this is the time of year when everybody starts to think about rushing off to college next fall. And just like your other guests, I think we need to start thinking about other pathways to a successful career beyond the one that takes most students right off to college 3 months after high school graduation. About 66% of American high school graduates go right off to college, but only about half of them actually finish in 4 years. And in fact, the largest share of people in this country with some college credit and no degree are people in their 20s. So we have a lot of youth out there now. We have a lot of young adults who have some college credit, some debt, and they don't have anything to show for it.
Why do they not finish?
Well, there's many reasons, but I think a lot of it is what your previous guests have brought up, is that, many people are just not cut out for college, and that's not a negative thing. We tend to think if somebody doesn't go to college, they're a failure. In fact, in my opinion, the goal of universal college has actually done more harm than good, because it diverted attention away from any real discussion of alternatives to a college education and has banished anything that smacks of job training to second-class status. A lot of parents proudly boast when their sons and daughters are accepted to college, but some of those same parents might be embarrassed if their children skip college for an apprenticeship, for example.
Nick Roman, back to you. Do people look down on you, do you think, because you're a welder, even though you're able now to pay your bills and have a 401k?
I get made fun of in the weld shop for having a college degree, which is something I never thought would happen. A lot of people, look at me, hey, and they go, "Why are you here? You have a college degree. Doesn't that open up more opportunities?" And, to an certain extent, yes, having a college degree does open up certain, opportunities to a person, but not all the time. I mean, I look at my coworkers who went from straight out of high school and didn't have a college degree, and are now, very well experienced and trained welders that are making, quite substantial amount of a salary. I know there are some out there that are making at least $100,000 a year. And for me, that is an amazing goal to look forward to, to reach that level of experience and talent in a trade to where I could, live at the same, wage or salary that somebody such as like a lawyer or somebody with a higher education is making at the same time.
So, Jeff Zelenko, back to you, author of There Is Life After College. Tell us a little bit more than we heard from Mike Rowe about some of the jobs that are available that are going unfilled because so many people are trying to go to college.
So, there's expected to be 25 million of all the new job openings in the next decade will be for what are called middle skill jobs. These are jobs that don't require a 4-year diploma, but they do require some sort of education after high school. And, as I was researching my book over the last couple of years, almost every single company I talked to basically told me we have no concern about filling our white collar jobs with people who have bachelor's degrees. In fact, we have too many of those types of students. We're really worried about advanced manufacturing jobs or healthcare jobs or information technology jobs that don't require necessarily a 4-year degree. We tend to think that blue-collar jobs are dirty and they're not fun, they're repetitive, but most of these jobs today require real skills. And I think we're doing a disservice to a whole generation of students by shipping them off to college, even if they don't really want to go there, when there are many other good pathways for them to succeed in life.
Mike Rowe, are we diminishing the importance of learning history, learning English, learning literature, learning philosophy, learning about the cultures that we live in?
In this conversation, I don't think we're diminishing it, but I think it's fair to say that for the last 20 minutes we haven't focused upon it. But it's, you can't do two things at once. I believe that unlike 30 or 40 years ago, we're experiencing, call it a democratization of education, unlike anything we've ever seen before. The entire history of the world is available to anybody with an internet connection and a smartphone. I just listened to a great podcast about philosophy this morning. I'm not comparing that to, an advanced studies program at Princeton, but in terms of access, it's never been better. And in terms of the way we elevate certain schools and certain jobs, I'll just leave you very briefly with this. I'm invited every year to comment on America's top jobs and America's top schools. Publications roll them out all the time. I pass every year because there is never a trade school on the list of top schools, and there is never a welding position listed on the list of top jobs. And my foundation has trained between 300 and 400 people, put them through welding school, and their stories are just like Nick's. We're simply not talking about the opportunities that actually exist, and we're reaping what we sow.
Mike Rowe, once again, host of the Discovery Channel's Dirty Jobs series. Great to have you on our program. Thanks very much for joining us. Well, and only back with To the Point, talking about the fact that it has become, that it is now thought that having a college degree, a 4-year degree, is necessary to get a job in this economy, evolving economy, despite the fact that people with college degrees often are not, in fact, qualified for the jobs that turn out to be available. But we do have in the presidential campaign now, of course, Bernie Sanders saying college should be free. Hillary Clinton say that at least it should be less expensive than it is. I want to turn to that question with Peter Capelli. He's director of the Center for Human Resources at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. He's author of Will College Pay Off? A Guide to the Most Important Financial Decision You'll Ever Make. Peter Capelli, welcome to our program. Good to have you.
Thank you.
We heard earlier on the program a bit about the marketing efforts that are made by colleges. And tell us, if you will, about the relationship between that and the extraordinary increase in the cost of going to college.
Well, I think, the cost of going to college is a little bit misleading because we're always focusing on the sticker price, and a rather big proportion of kids in the U.S., over a majority, get some kind of financial aid. And the financial aid is often pretty dramatic. In fact, the costs between state and private schools now are not actually so great. So the big surprise in terms of costs is that they've risen primarily and largely at the state level. So it's the state schools that have raised their tuition the most, and the reason is because the state legislatures have cut back their support for education. So there's part of what's driven a lot of this is the view that, well, college graduates are going to make a lot more money, so they should pay for their education. They should pay more for it. Why should we subsidize them? So there's a little bit of a cycle going on with the conversation we were having earlier. Everybody assumes college graduates are going to make a lot of money, so therefore why don't we charge them more? Why don't they pay more of the full cost of college? And, some of the very high tuition that you pay at the elite schools, if you have a lot of money, goes to, frankly, subsidize those kids from families that don't have a lot of money. So in the snootier schools, if your family makes less than $100,000 a year, tuition is more or less free.
But what about the $1.3 trillion in debt that college graduates now are collectively bargained with? I thought at first it was billion, but I was corrected. It's trillion.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's trillion. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but that's certainly a big concern for sure. And I think a lot of it is a lot more kids are going to college who a while ago would not have gone. And whether they ought to go or not is a very good question. As you heard earlier, the big concern is people going to college and not graduating. 60% graduate in 6 years, 40% graduate in 4 years. And so for those kids, they take on all the debt and they get no bump from going to college. So for them, the ability to pay this thing off is incredibly difficult. And that's, I think, what we ought to be particularly worried about is the kids who go to college and never graduate and probably shouldn't have gone in the first place. We could have bet that they wouldn't do very well in college, and yet they feel this pressure to go.
Are the legislators that you talked about, who think everybody ought to pay their own way, interested at all in the idea of vocational schools? That's something that states traditionally would seem to me have gotten behind. Have they fallen away in that regard as well?
Yeah, they fell away a long time ago, and I think some of this was from the left or the progressive side, the view that vocational education was going to track kids down a path that was not going to give them the opportunity of college. So vocational education declined sharply in the U.S., and apprenticeship programs have fallen by more than half just in the 2000s, in the first 9 or so years of the 2000s. And also job training has declined quite dramatically as well. So the problem with your conversation earlier is that, unfortunately, there's not a good path for kids who don't go to college. There are very few employers who will hire kids right out of school and train them. They want somebody who's already trained. And if you want an apprenticeship program, good luck. They're very hard to get. And if you want vocational education now, it's hard to get it in high school. You've got to go to college. So we forget that a lot of the college experience we're talking about here is community college. And if you want to become a plumber or an electrician or a welder, your best bet to do this, by far the cheapest way, is to go to college, but you got to go to community college. And I should say both of my kids who have liberal arts degrees, both of them have been in these programs of going back to community colleges and trying to get job skills. And, you know, it's a pretty expensive way to do it because you got to go to college and you got to stop working while you do it.
And then you go back to school after that.
I was thinking particularly you got to go back to school after you graduate from four-year to get these practical degrees, which employers used to provide that kind of training. They're not doing it anymore. Apprenticeships used to do it. Those are gone as well.
Peter Capelli, once again, at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. Dorothy Rothrock is with us. She's president of the California Manufacturers and Technology Association, and it's good to have you on our program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us from your standpoint, you represent employers, I take it. What's your take on the issues that we've been discussing?
Well, what's a very big concern for the manufacturers that I represent here in California is that there's a huge need for skilled workers that we can't fill. And part of the reason you've heard in the program so far, but I think that there's a lack of awareness that there's incredible opportunities in manufacturing, that these jobs are very exciting, they deal with a lot of problem solving, there's huge opportunities for growth when you get into these jobs, and that, of course, they pay very well, and it can make for a very wonderful career in the long term.
If skilled workers are needed, you say you can't fill the jobs. What's happening as a result?
Well, companies are global in nature. Often manufacturing will find the most hospitable places in which to set up shop and do business. And to the extent there's workforce available around the world, that's where you may see some expansion. California is home to most of the manufacturing in the country, and we're seeing some growth here since the end of the recession. And my real concern is that the lack of a skilled workforce, the availability of skilled workers, is going to put a damper on our ability to grow here, and it's going to encourage companies to look elsewhere.
Tell us more about these jobs that you described earlier as exciting and creative and very satisfying.
Well, you've heard about the welding and machinists and other kinds of technical work that's done by manufacturers, but the innovation that's occurring on the shop floor is simply amazing. If you haven't visited a manufacturer lately, I encourage you to do so. Everything is automated. There's computers. The machinery is as high-tech as you can get, and the productivity of a worker is what justifies the high wages that they're able to be paid. So as companies become more and more productive, these jobs are higher and higher paying, and it makes for a very kind of a long-term, legitimate, and not just entry-level type work, but a real career.
What about the numbers involved, though? We often hear that automation leads to fewer jobs, even though the jobs that remain are better jobs.
Actually, that's wrong. I don't remember the study, but I recently read that when productivity increases through the adoption of innovation and machinery and equipment, it actually sets the foundation for future job growth. We have an expanding economy, and companies can grow when they become more efficient, more productive, and that leads to more employment. So it's not a declining job situation. It's actually going to increase in the future. And one dynamic that's going on that you haven't mentioned is that we have the baby boomer generation is retiring now, and those are a very highly skilled group of people. And replacing those workers as well as filling the expanded economy that we are enjoying and will enjoy over the next decades is creating huge numbers of job opportunities.
Why are so many jobs low wage. In California, we're now talking about this state, 1 out of 5 workers are at the poverty line.
Well, you're not talking about manufacturing jobs there, probably, right?
Apparently not.
Manufacturers have layers of jobs, just like any industry. We like the idea that entry-level jobs are available for folks that have relatively low skills. But I don't know of a single company that isn't interested in taking those entry-level workers and moving them up as quickly as possible into the workforce. The more productive they are, the better it is for the employer.
Peter Capelli, back to you at the University of Pennsylvania. Is it a good idea for students in advance to identify what job they want to do, or should they try to get sort of generalized skills because the economy is changing so fast?
No, I think that's a good point. If you look at the hottest job in America last year and the previous 2 years, that was petroleum engineering, which paid about 50% more than the next highest paid job. And this year that job is completely dead. So I think that is one of the tricks, is that it's very difficult if you're a student to chase the labor market, partly because it changes a lot. Sometimes technology eliminates certain jobs. And sometimes, you have a very specific degree and you happen to graduate at a point where they're not hiring. And what do you do with that very specific degree in hospital records administration or something like that, So I think that is one of the problems. I just wanted to comment a bit about the idea, which is unfortunately not right, that there are a lot of good jobs out there just waiting for people to have who have the skills to show up and do them. We have very little wage pressure in the U.S. There's very little evidence that jobs are really in short supply. This is one of the problems for kids. We don't want to make it sound like, because unfortunately it's just not true, that if kids would only get some skills, they would be sucked up. If you look at the surveys of what employers want, they want experience. That's the number one thing. They want people who have worked in these jobs already, and that's a very difficult thing to do if you are a student looking for somebody to hire you and you don't yet have those skills. So the kids are really in a bit of a bind here. It's a very difficult situation, and that's partly why they're going to college. They're trying like crazy to figure out where the jobs are. And the problem is the path to those jobs is unfortunately just not very clear.
Dorothy Rothrock, a quick comment on that?
Well, one of the comments was that the companies aren't taking on employees that have skills training needs as much as in the past. And we're seeing that change here in California, and I think perhaps in other states as well. The companies are combining with the community colleges and creating consortiums on a regional level to help provide a pipeline into the companies. And this is being done in a self-directed way, so that the jobs are there at the time that the students get through the programs, because there's a pipeline that's been built. And I think that that's the kind of thing that at a local level can really work to help overcome some of the things we've heard about here today.
Okay, we're almost out of time. I want to go back to Jeff Zelenko. There is Life After College, his book. He's also a contributor to the Washington Post. What's your advice to somebody right now who's getting an acceptance to college or thinking about all of this? What do you do to best prepare yourself for the future?
Well, I think if you just got an acceptance to college, I think you want to make sure you don't take on too much debt. I think the more debt you take on in your undergraduate years, it really limits your ability to move to cities with dynamic economies or to even take unpaid internships. Internships are important. As Peter Capelli brought up, employers want work experience. I'm finding in the research for my book that 50 to 75% of new hires at companies now come from the intern pools of those companies. So in other words, if you didn't intern there, you're probably not going to get a job there. And then finally, go to cities and where the economy lines up with what you want to do. If you want to work in film, go to New York or LA. If you want to work in music, go to Nashville. Increasingly, experiential learning is critical to somebody at the undergraduate level.
Is it still worth the investment to go to college?
Overall, I mean, if you look at the averages, it is still worth an investment, but not if you have no idea what you want to do, not if it's going to cost you a lot of money, and especially if you're going to have to go into a lot of debt to go there. I think then I would take a gap year. There are many new gap year programs that are not expensive, that give people work experience, that give people academic experience. You get to travel. And in that time, you could kind of figure out what you want to do. We're living longer. We're going to be working longer. There's no reason that students should rush off to college at 18 just because that's the way we've always done it.
And we started talking about the presidential campaign. How are college kids likely to vote?
Well, most young people right now support Bernie Sanders, largely because he has the free college idea, and I think that he's seen a lot of support because of his economic message.
Well, thank you all very much for being on our program. Jeff Zelenko, once again, author of There Is Life After College. Dorothy Rothrock, president of the California Manufacturers and Technology Association. Peter Capelli at the Center for Human Resources, University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. And our earlier guest, Nick Roman, our college graduate who has retrained to be a welder. And Mike Rowe, the host of the Discovery Channel series Dirty Jobs.